In the silent, claustrophobic cells of Nuremberg, a master narrative was born. Albert Speer, the architect-turned-armaments minister of the Third Reich, presented Allied interrogators with a compelling, self-serving explanation for Germany's military defeat. In Speer's telling, Germany's industrial failure during the critical opening years of the global conflict was not a matter of physical limitation, but of political cowardice. He argued that Adolf Hitler, haunted by the revolutionary specter of November 1918 when a starving home front brought down the Kaiser's empire, had pathological anxieties about demanding sacrifices from the German working class. Consequently, Speer claimed that while Great Britain and the Soviet Union ruthlessly stripped their civilian economies to feed their war machines, the German population was permitted to enjoy consumer luxuries, cosmetics, and a peacetime lifestyle. This Speer Thesis established a durable historical myth, that Germany fought the first half of the war with a soft, under-mobilized civilian economy, and that only Speer's technocratic intervention in 1942 unleashed the true total war potential of German industry. Yet, the cold ledger of economic history tells a radically different story. Modern research has shattered Speer's claims of early consumer complacency, revealing them to be a calculated post-war deception designed to mask the structural contradictions of the National Socialist regime. The historical reality is that Germany did not possess a soft, unmobilized economy in September 1939. On the contrary, the Third Reich was already operating at an unprecedented level of military mobilization. By 1938, direct and indirect military expenditures devoured nearly 23% of Germany's gross national product, a staggering figure that soared to over 38% by the end of 1939. For comparison, Great Britain's defense expenditure did not surpass 15% of its national product until after the Munich crisis, only reaching full capacity after the catastrophic fall of France in 1940. German civilians were not living in comfortable luxury. Severe food, fuel, and clothing rationing was implemented on the very first day of the Polish campaign. The civilian standard of living had been systematically, ruthlessly suppressed throughout the late 1930s to feed the voracious appetites of Hermann Göring's four-year plan. The actual barrier to a massive expansion of German armaments production between 1939 and 1941 was not a lack of political will or Hitler's fear of a domestic revolution. Rather, it was the structural composition of the German economy itself. Since 1936, the National Socialist state had pursued an aggressive policy of armament in depth. This strategy directed billions of Reichsmarks away from immediate weapons assembly and toward massive, long-term capital infrastructure projects. These resources were sunk into constructing synthetic fuel plants, coal liquefaction facilities, artificial rubber installations, giant state-owned steel complexes like the Salzgitter works, and basic industrial machinery. Because these foundational investments required years of preparation and construction before they could yield actual weapons, they created a massive drag on immediate armaments output. When Germany marched to war, its industrial landscape was choked with half-completed chemical plants and unbuilt rail links. The spectacular rise in weapons production recorded under Speer's tenure in 1943 and 1944 was not a sudden total war miracle but rather the delayed, inevitable maturation of these pre-war capital investments finally bearing fruit. To understand why an early total war decree would have failed to yield a massive surge in immediate weapons output, one must analyze the brutal, uncompromising mathematics of Germany's raw material balance and foreign exchange reserves. Under the gold standard and international trade networks of the mid-20th century, Germany was a structurally resource-poor nation. It was almost entirely dependent on external sources for its supply of high-grade iron ore, copper, nickel, manganese, chrome, rubber, and petroleum. To purchase these critical industrial ingredients, Germany required hard foreign currency, foreign exchange. However, the regime's aggressive, militarized economic policies had destroyed its export trade and drained its gold reserves to near zero by 1937. This constant crisis of foreign exchange, known in internal German documents as the Divisionat, meant that the Third Reich was locked in a perpetual, desperate struggle to import the raw materials necessary to keep its existing factories running. The rapid conquests of 1939 and 1940 did not solve this fundamental equation. Indeed, they frequently made it worse by adding millions of conquered civilians to feed and occupied factories to supply, without yielding the raw materials needed to do so. The allocation of steel, the primary currency of modern industrial warfare, illustrates this structural gridlock. Throughout the pre-war rearmament drive, the German military branches waged a fierce, tribal civil war over steel quotas. When Hitler or the military commanders attempted to solve these bottlenecks by simply demanding more weapons, they ran headlong into the physical reality that steel production was capped by the availability of high-quality iron ore and coking coal. Germany's domestic iron ore was low-grade and highly acidic, requiring immense amounts of coal to smelt, which meant that German heavy industry was structurally dependent on the seasonal shipping of high-grade Swedish iron ore through the Baltic Sea. If Germany had attempted to double its tank production in 1940, the steel required would have had to be stolen directly from the construction of synthetic oil plants, the maintenance of railway locomotives, or the production of merchant shipping, causing an immediate, catastrophic systemic collapse elsewhere in the war machine. The oil and rubber bottlenecks were even more unforgiving. Prior to the invasion of the Soviet Union, Germany's military operations were fueled largely by stocks plundered from occupied Western Europe and a steady supply of crude oil purchased from the Soviet Union under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Synthetic oil production, though growing rapidly, could not keep pace with the voracious appetite of a fully mobilized Wehrmacht. Similarly, the supply of natural rubber was entirely cut off by the Allied naval blockade, forcing Germany to rely on the complex, energy-intensive chemical synthesis of artificial rubber, known as Buna. The production of Buna was a massive consumer of electrical power and coal. A single Buna plant consumed more electricity than the entire city of Berlin. Thus, any attempt to expand weapons production early in the war would have immediately collided with the absolute limits of the domestic electrical grid and the coal transport network. The bottleneck was not a lack of assembly plants, but rather a lack of the physical power and raw materials required to feed them. Any additional machinery ordered by a total war decree in 1940 would have sat idle and cold for want of coal, steel, and oil. A cornerstone of the Speer Thesis, and a major focal point for post-war historians, was the apparent failure of the National Socialist regime to mobilize German female labor to the same extent as its democratic adversaries. In 1940 and 1941, as British women poured into aircraft factories, munitions plants, and auxiliary military roles, German factories remained heavily staffed by male workers, hundreds of thousands of whom had to be systematically exempted from military conscription to keep the production lines moving. Speer and his supporters argued that this was a failure of political ideology, claiming that the Nazi leadership was ideologically committed to a conservative, patriarchal vision of motherhood that kept women out of industrial work. While National Socialist propaganda certainly celebrated the role of the German mother as a domestic anchor, modern economic research reveals that the failure to mobilize German women into industrial factories was not a choice dictated by ideology, but rather a direct consequence of the structural backwardness of the German agricultural sector. Unlike Great Britain, which possessed a highly consolidated, mechanized, and urbanized agricultural system that relied on global imports for food, Germany in 1939 remained a nation of small, family-owned peasant farms. This agricultural sector was incredibly labor-intensive and structurally inefficient, relying on millions of unpaid family workers, predominantly peasant women, to plant and harvest crops. When the Wehrmacht conscripted millions of young German men from the countryside in 1939 and 1940, it created an immediate, severe labor deficit in the fields. Had the Nazi regime attempted to forcibly draft rural or suburban German women into urban munitions factories, the domestic agricultural sector would have collapsed instantly, precipitating a catastrophic national food crisis far worse than the starvation blockades of the First World War. German women were, in fact, already fully mobilized, they were simply working 80-hour weeks on family farms, tending livestock and harvesting grain to keep the nation fed, rather than assembling artillery shells in metropolitan industrial centers. Furthermore, the German labor market was already operating at absolute capacity long before the first shots were fired in Poland. Unemployment had been virtually eliminated by 1937, and by 1939, German industry was experiencing a desperate deficit of over 1 million skilled workers, particularly in the machine tool, mining, and metalworking sectors. This extreme shortage meant that simply ordering the construction of new tank or aircraft factories would not increase output, as there were no free workers to operate the machinery. To resolve this structural deadlock, the regime was eventually forced to resort to the brutal, state-sponsored kidnapping and exploitation of millions of foreign civilian workers and prisoners of war under the direction of Fritz Sauckel. This forced labor system was not an elegant, planned component of a total war economy, but rather a violent, improvised response to the complete exhaustion of Germany's domestic human resources. Any attempt to accelerate total war production in 1940 would have encountered this labor wall, and without the massive, systematic territorial conquests that later fueled the slave labor programs, the German economy lacked the domestic manpower to support any greater level of industrial expansion. If we accept the counterfactual premise that Germany somehow overcame its raw material, financial, and labor bottlenecks in 1939 to produce masses of extra weapons, we must analyze how this increased output would have manifested on the battlefields of Europe. The prevailing popular assumption is that an overwhelming abundance of panzers, artillery, and combat aircraft would have allowed the Wehrmacht to decisively crush the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa in 1941, or sweep the Royal Air Force from the skies during the Battle of Britain. However, a rigorous logistical analysis of these campaigns reveals that more weapons would not have solved Germany's strategic crises. In fact, an excess of heavy equipment would have likely accelerated the collapse of the German war machine by placing an unsustainable, crushing burden on its already fragile supply lines. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 failed not because the Wehrmacht lacked tanks or infantry weapons, but because the campaign was an operational overreach that exceeded the physical and geographical limits of continental logistics. The vast, undeveloped spaces of the Soviet Union, combined with a primitive, sparse road network and a completely different railway track gauge, proved to be an insurmountable obstacle for German supply units. The Wehrmacht entered the campaign with a highly heterogeneous, non-standardized transport fleet comprising hundreds of different civilian and captured truck models, for which there were almost no spare parts. Within weeks of crossing the border, the abrasive Russian dust and thick autumn mud destroyed thousands of these transport vehicles, leaving the advancing combat divisions stranded without fuel, ammunition, or food. Had Germany possessed 5,000 more panzers in the summer of 1941, they would have simply sat abandoned on the side of the dirt roads of Belarus and Ukraine, having run completely out of fuel and lubricating oil. Indeed, adding more thirsty, maintenance-heavy armored vehicles to the invasion force would have only compounded the logistical nightmare, choking the few available supply corridors and starving the existing infantry divisions of essential supplies. A similar operational bottleneck governed the aerial campaigns of the Luftwaffe. During the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940, the primary limiting factor for German air operations was not the number of aircraft on hand, but the availability of high-grade aviation gasoline. German synthetic fuel plants, operating at maximum capacity, could barely produce enough high-octane aviation fuel to keep existing combat wings flying. Luftwaffe units were frequently forced to curtail their sorties or ground entire wings because fuel depots were empty. If the German aviation industry had produced double the number of Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters and Heinkel E-111 bombers earlier in the year, the Luftwaffe would have lacked the refined petroleum to fly them. Furthermore, the operational range of these aircraft was dictated by technological and aerodynamic realities, not production volumes. No amount of extra manufacturing could have extended the Bf 109's limited 30-minute combat radius over London. Ultimately, The strategic outcome of the war was decided by global geopolitical alignments and the overwhelming, structural resource superiority of the Allied coalition, which possessed vast, secure continental empires and unlimited access to international oil reserves. Extra German weapons in 1940 and 1941 would have merely generated a larger pile of burning metal on the steppes of Russia and the fields of southern England, without altering the fundamental trajectory of a war of attrition that Germany was economically doomed to lose. In concluding this structural investigation into the possibilities and limits of early German war mobilization, it becomes clear that the counterfactual premise of an early German total war is an economic and physical impossibility. Albert Speer's post-war narrative of a lazy, consumer-oriented Germany was a calculated deception designed to elevate his own historical reputation while deflecting blame for the regime's eventual military collapse onto Hitler's domestic anxieties. The Third Reich did not lose the war because it hesitated to mobilize, it lost because its aggressive, ideologically driven foreign policy forced it into a massive, multi-front war of attrition against the world's greatest industrial and empire-backed powers, Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, whose collective resource base, financial reserves, and population pools were structurally, and insurmountably, superior. The dramatic rise in German weapons production that occurred under Speer's ministry in 1943 and 1944 was not an economic miracle achieved by a sudden transition to total war. Rather, it was the inevitable, delayed result of massive pre-war investments in synthetic fuel, steelworks, and chemical infrastructure finally coming online, combined with a brutal, systematic campaign of plundering occupied Europe and exploiting millions of forced laborers. Even at its peak in 1944, this production surge was entirely hollow. The thousands of newly manufactured tanks and aircraft could not be fueled, could not be staffed by experienced crews, and could not be transported to the front lines because the domestic railway system had collapsed under the weight of Allied strategic bombing and a severe coal famine. In the final strategic ledger, Germany's defeat was not a failure of industrial mobilization, but the inevitable consequence of a deeply flawed, hyper-aggressive strategy that ignored the cold, hard realities of global economic geography. Ultimately, the story of Germany's wartime economy serves as a powerful reminder of the limits of industrial output when divorced from geographical and resource realities. The Wehrmacht's tactical brilliance could not compensate for the structural scarcity that governed every decision in Berlin. When we ask what if Germany had built more weapons earlier, we must remember that a machine cannot run without fuel, a factory cannot operate without raw materials, and an empire cannot survive when it is structurally and economically outmatched by a global coalition.